Hello and a warm welcome to the history session 2 of the IAPH 2021. I'm very sorry for the short delay. There was some problem with the Zoom link. So we've got 4 very interesting speakers this morning, and I'm really excited to present them to you today. And our first speaker is Andrea Perez Fernandez. And I can see you're here, which is great. And you all found the correct link. Andrea Perez Fernandez is a pre-doctoral researcher at ADHUC Research Center for Theory, Gender, and Sexuality. And she's a PhD candidate at the Philosophy and Gender Seminar at Barcelona University. In 2017, she graduated in journalism and she holds a master's degree in citizenship and human rights, ethics and politics. And she studies the political dimension of the works of Hannah Höch. And her doctoral research focuses on vulnerability in women's philosophical thought, contributions to the debate around present emergencies. And today, Andrea Perez Fernandez is going to talk to us about the role of the vulnerable in the work of Hannah Höch.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the presentation. Clara, I will try to share my screen.
Yes.
Just a minute, because my computer is pretty slowly these days, but I think I can. Okay. I think now you're seeing.
Great, that's wonderful.
My computer. And yeah, now you see the full PDF. Okay, so if you're listening and seeing the slides correctly, I start. Hi, good morning, everyone. As Clara says, well, first of all, I would like to thank the conference organizers and all of you who are here. I'm Andrea, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Philosophy and Gender and Seminar. And as you said, I'm in a part of a project named Vulnerability in Women's Philosophical Thought, Contributions to the Debate Around Present Emergencies. And it's an investigation that seeks to deepen into topics related to violence and vulnerability through the work of the 20th women thinkers and researchers like Stefania Fantauzi, Lorena Fuste, Teresa Hogeven, and Georgina Rabasso, who also are scheduled in this conference, are part of the project too. And as you said, my research, which is still in progress, I mean the half of my research, studies the political dimension of the work of German artist Hannah Höch, in particular through her interwar photomontages and her writings and interviews on that topic. So today I will try to think to what extent we can apply vulnerable as an adjective when talking about Hannah Höch's practice of photomontage. As you may know, vulnerability is a very polysemic category and has become increasingly central to ethics and political philosophy. And my aim here is not making a genealogy of this concept or trying to fit Höch's thought in one of its established meanings. In fact, I borrowed this concept from an interpretation of Vicente Aliaga, the curator of the biggest retrospective of Höch that has been done in Spain, and I use it as an excuse to make just a small displacement in order to see Höch's work from an unusual point of view, thinking more with Aliaga than against him. I have divided my presentation in 2 parts. First, as an introduction, I will give some notes on Höch's profile, especially for those who are not familiar with her work, but also stressing some points that are normally forgotten in mainstream approaches. And second, I made some reflections on the hypothesis of Aliaga and proposed some elements to make more concrete his interpretation of the role of the vulnerable in Huck's work. I've prepared, as you can see, some slides just to show you examples of different sides of Huck's work. As you can see, we have a lot of different work in Huck. She is a very long-lived figure, and she has like oil photomontages, dress designs. She was very polyphacetic and very heterodox in her style. So let's start with the first point. Who is Hannah Höch? Höch was a German artist who lived from 1889 to 1978. That is the rise and fall of the Weimar Republic and the two world wars. She's known above all for her membership of the avant-garde Dada movement in Berlin and for being one of the pioneers of photomontage during interwar Germany. Nevertheless, she also excelled in painting, decorative arts, and embroidery. Besides, she was involved in many different artistic and intellectual circles and became friends with figures such as Mondrian, Arthur Segal, Kurt and Elma Sweeters, or Sophie Tauber and Jan Arp. I say this because I think that the work of Höch is not just important for her participation in Dada, but also because in this time, in the time of the Weimar Republic, positions were pretty dogmatic, and Höch had the ability, was very capable of maintaining relationships with people who think differently and with different approaches to art and politics in this period. So we have brief text partially available by Höch, like poems, short fiction text, article on embroidery, interviews, a 3-page autobiography, and some writings on Dada and photomontage, as well as dispersed quotations from German language and out-of-print volumes, which I try to collect. And how can we situate her politically? Due to the Berlin Dadaist links with communist circles in interwar Germany, it is pretty easy to take a biased view of her work by reducing it to an appendix of that of her colleagues, or to split her career into a revolutionary period, which would be associated to her youth and to her relationship with Raoul Hausmann, nicknamed by his colleagues the Dadasov, and another period in later life, which was more depoliticized, linked to abstraction. Raoul Hausmann was one of the leaders of the Dada movement, and he was related to anarchism. Even some of the leaders of Dada movement also were clearly communist, were affiliated to the KPD. So to what extent are these interpretations that split her career or that made an overlap between her thinking and the think of their colleagues are fair? It's absolutely true that some of her claims seem ambiguous at first sight. For example, she never claimed to be a communist, but once said to her sister in a letter that communism was the only solution for Europe. Or she never claimed to be a feminist or participate in feminist movements, but part of her work is an acid critique of gender roles. Either way, I propose not seeing these apparent contradictions as evidence of the absence of thinking, but as signs of a kind of thinking that does not fit the labels usually applied to political engagement in the period. In this respect, I will note 3 data which I think are significant. First, Höch was always very autonomous in relation to the movement, to the Dada movement in Berlin, both in her style, her way of living, and in her relationships with other intellectual or artists, at the expenses of Raoul Hausmann wishes. She said that Raoul Hausmann was always trying to put in the middle of her relationships with other people, not because she was incapable of maintaining them, but because he liked to control them. So, and as you have seen, she was a very long-lived figure, so of course her thinking is far to be completely static. Second, she suffered National Socialist repression when she was labeled a cultural Bolshevik and had to move in 1939 from Berlin to a little house in Heiligenstadt, a northern suburb of Berlin. And during the years of National Socialism, she continued working, but very isolated and with no economical support from the outside. For the record, she hid there a large part of the works of the Dadaists, aware that she could be killed for it because they were degenerate art. And third, although she became very fed up with being identified only with Dada, she never completely distanced herself from it, as she understood that it was a way of seeing the world. Likewise, photomontage and its principles are a constant in her work. Thus, in a way, I consider that there is a gaze that is maintained, even if it looks from different places or experiences. As a more concrete example of her practice, I'd like to note that from 1916 to 1926, 10 years, Hannah Höch worked 3 days a week for the largest publishing house in Berlin named Ullstein Verlag. And as a designer of embroidered and lace clothes in the handiwork division, she had easy access to multiple copies of the sewing and handiwork patterns produced by the firm. But she also collected pictures of other Ullstein publications, as for example, the Berliner Illustrated Zeitung, the Illustrated magazine Beats, from where she took, among others, a well-known photograph of Defense Minister Gustav Noske and Reich President Friedrich Ebert, taken at a Baltic Sea resort just 2 weeks after the Weimar Constitution had been signed into law. As you can see in the slides, in Heads of State, Höch parodies the social democratic politicians, as Maria Makela puts it, and I quote, "acknowledging their pouncey figures atop an iron-on embroidery pattern, associating them not with the traditional male realm of state formation, but with the female domain of leisure relaxation," end quote. She used the same search image in another photomontage that you also can see in small, named Dada Panorama, where she spoofed the government military alliance by linking Ebert's military dress boots to the phrase "against damn feet," a slogan then used to advertise a popular antiperspirant for feet. And now I move to the second part. In the catalog of a retrospective of Höch held at the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid, the curator, Vicente Aliaga, highlighted the role of the small, the tiny, and the vulnerable, as he put it, as available repository of sensations and images for the artist while referring to her handicraft works. Here, we can understand vulnerable in its usual meaning as something fragile, and accordingly, when talking about her heterodox style, he described it, her trademark, as, I quote, "an individuality fractured by blows, fragile and strong at the same time, shaped by circumstances and adversity, but with a rare determination to overcome social and political obstacles, as well as an unwavering will to express itself," end quote. While I agree with his words, this led me to wonder, first, whether it makes sense to talk about vulnerability in the context of Höch's practices, and second, if her originality or the specificity of her gaze rests on a sort of combination of fragile and strong impulses. In this regard, I would like to point two issues. The first, if we use vulnerability when talking about the materials or the elements that Höch puts into play, for example, the use of crafts or patterns, also for her photomontages, we must take into account that her own text make an early critique of the hierarchy of artistic materials and genres, that is, on the distinction between art and craft, and the disdain for crafts traditionally carried out by women. Her articles on embroidery, published in the prestigious needlework journal Stickerei und Rundschau, Embroidery and Lace Review in German, claimed the art of embroidery as a further artistic discipline. In 1919, she wrote, I quote, "Embroidery is closely related to painting. It changes instantly with every period style. It is an art and can claim to be treated as such," end quote, and engages Höch with the idea of a continuous development of this art, a process whose subjects are, with no doubt, women who embroider. And I quote again, "Just as today in painting, it is not enough for a naturalistic flower, still life or nude, to be a poor imitation. In the future, embroidery will have to introduce an abstract sense of form so that beauty, feelings, spirit, and even soul can appear," end quote. I think it's very remarkable to think that she's talking about soul in a discourse or in an article related to handicraft, related to embroidery and women, because the idea of talking about the soul has a lot to do with the idea of genius and the romantic conception of art, and it's not usually framed with women's art. So I think it's important to know that. So the point here for me is that her way of reclaiming the artistical status of embroidery doesn't consist of idealizing what is revealed by the canon but by putting forward her conviction that all graded classifications are founded on arbitrary principles and should therefore be reassessed. So in short, she's not trying to stress the wonders of low art, but trying to destroy the hierarchy between arts and craft genres. Just as an example of Höeg's textile work reputation at the time, Alexander Coe, the preeminent patron of the decorative arts then, declared that she was a new talent who deserved attention, and used musical metaphors to review her work, talking about, for example, melodies of lines, Asian-influenced colors, harmony, or complex rhythms. Also, the critical leader of the Weimar avant-garde, Adolf Perez, emphasized her truly modern feeling for color and form. And now I move to the second issue relating to talk in terms of vulnerability in Höeg's work. For me, unless we are talking about her life and not about her artistic practices, the fact of looking for the originality in her work in a combination of antithetic principles, it's not inadequate, but trivial. In which sense? In the sense that the description could fit perfectly to every German Dada artist, since for Dadaist, art had a lot to do with the idea of balance. As the expert in Dada, Hanne Bergius, says, I quote, always in the tension of a dynamic balance of contradictions, the Dadaist opened art, on the one hand, to chaotic and destructive abysses, and invented, on the other hand, adequate structures. The aesthetic experience of destruction and creation threw light on the productive breaks initiated by Dada, the breaks of multimateriality, polyvalence, multifocality, relativity, fragment, chance, process, and the ephemeral. Bergius considers that in the case of Dada, the idea of beauty must be linked to this idea of equilibrium, of balance between opposites, principles. I'm not an expert on his philosophy, but it's very important here to have in mind Salomo Freuländer, who talked about creative indifference, because it has a lot to do with this idea of balance of contradictions in Dada. And he was known as the Charlie Chaplin, or as a mixture between Kant and a clown. So he's very related with Dada movement in Berlin. Thus, in the light of this, the following quote from Höeg makes more sense in light of this idea of balance, rather than in terms of praising the fragility of an object or individuality. While talking about the topics of her art, she said, symbols of growth and extinction, love and hate, glorification and rejection, but also the search for beauty, hidden beauty in particular. So what's the point of talking about vulnerability in Höeg? I think that what is interesting to stress in Höeg's thinking is more linked to the world than to individuals. I mean, in her case, I find more appropriate to think of vulnerability as a characteristic of the relations that constitute the common world, and not as an attribute of a particular object or individual. So perhaps a less anachronistic word would be fragility in this regard. And it's the fact that relations that constitute the world are not naturally fixed that makes it possible to change them, also by showing their arbitrariness. In this sense, while talking about Dada, Höeg said that she and her colleagues, and I quote, were trying to point out that things could also be done differently, and that many of our conventional ways of thinking, dressing, or reckoning are no less arbitrary than others which are generally accepted, end quote. So what's doing Höeg? Höeg decontextualizes the image, cropping them, repositioning them, inverting them, and in this way, as Brecht did with his epic theater in the same period, she shows the controllable side of things by distancing them. But, and I'm done, this displacement from the individual to the world also implies accepting world's contingency and the impossibility of fully controlling the results of our actions. In this regard, there is a certain degree of uncertainty in Höeg's practice of the contextualization. In a sense, however systematic Höeg's method was, it was free. And for her, this meant being open to spontaneity, to something new. Höeg says, I quote, we will have to set on voyage of exploration, to set out unconditionally, and above all, we will have to remain receptive to the stimuli of change, which here, more than in any other context, are ready to constantly and lavishly regale of our imagination, end quote. A commentator on Hogg's work, Gunda Lincoln, writes that, and I quote again, Hogg tried to create novel images which, in her opinion, could only be described as successful when the distance from the basic illustrations was already so radical that it was impossible to recognize the source, end quote. So that is to say, in the creative procedure, something is lost, the old context, the way in which relationships had previously crystallized, or at least it is only present in the public's mind. The sculptor Siegfried Kuhl, a close friend of Hogg, explained in an interview that they used to brainstorm about a title after, and I put in bold this, after making a composition, and that she always liked titles that were a bit vague. And I think this could be a good anecdote or a good phrase to end with. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for this very informative talk about her. Okay, then I think we're going to move to the next talk, and Eva Palomo is a colleague also from Spain. And Eva Palomo teaches on moral philosophy at Rey Juan Carlos University in Madrid as a visiting lecturer, and she did her PhD in interdisciplinary gender studies, and her thesis focused on feminism and socialism in the works of Sylvia Pankhurst and the debates on class, gender, and sexuality in the context of British suffragism. And her research interests are ethics, history of feminist ideas and movements, and gender violence. And she's the author of the book Sylvia Pankhurst, Suffragista y Socialista, and which is one of the main works in Spanish on Sylvia Pankhurst, and most of her work is related to 19th century feminist, class, gender debates, and the relation between feminism and other social movements. And we are really excited today. She's going to present her work on 19th century women philosophers and the critique of the naturalization of gender inequality in the context of women's suffrage.
Good morning to all. Thank you very much, Clara. And I really appreciate the organization and university for accepting my contribution to the Congress. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how inequality between women and men in its different expressions has been historically legitimated by philosophical, political, religious, and cultural discourses based on the argument of nature. That's what I'm going to focus on. Nature was understood as a determinant and immutable factor justifying misogyny and female physical, intellectual, moral, and social inferiority, as well as a symbol of feminine essence to be dominated by males. The belief in the existence of a different and complementary nature of the sexes has been present in all human spheres until today. And this appears to be a very resilient discourse, in my opinion. We have a lot of present examples like all biologicism, even some new age trends, all the Mars-Venus issue. Well, and if we think of it since the 80s, we know a lot of discourses, both in popular and academic culture, as was analyzed by Susan Faludi in her great book, Backlash, the Undeclared War Against American Women. That was in 1991. Okay, so due to the development of women and gender studies, we are becoming more aware of this long tradition of thinkers who have opposed this natural order, both in pre and post-Enlightenment times. Throughout the 19th century, many social reformers, radicals, and socialists, both utopians and Marxists, rejected the idea of class and gender inequality as biologically determined by nature. I like to quote John Stuart Mill when he says, "But was there ever any domination that did not seem natural to those who exercise it?" Which I think is very good. I will focus on different critical responses to the discourse of nature present in women's writings as moral and political philosophers that were committed to the ideals of equality and in most cases to women's suffrage struggles during the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. In different ways, they have all contributed to explain the patriarchal mechanisms of oppression. I will stick to British and US authors as these are the movements, social movements, feminist movements I have studied, right? I wish to refer to Mary Ellen Waite's reflection in her great history of women philosophers on how the study of women philosophers remains always open, and there's this sort of continuum from thinkers with quite better known philosophical works, and others as moral and political philosophers and activists with sort of more scattered and difficult to trace works, less systematic, right? The idea to include more authors as they are being studied. And the other day she talked about we had to be female detectives, you know, in order to make all these contributions visible. So we have always to take into account the difficulty in recovering and analyzing all these ideas of female thinkers due to androcentric bias in the academic and scientific community. Of course, many women were self-taught. They even had to study in an almost clandestine way. And sometimes we have to trace their contributions, analyzing articles, pamphlets, memories, and correspondence. This last is very interesting. Authors like Mary Cross are really studying correspondence. You know, all these women in the 19th century, in their letters, they would write a lot about their ideas, which they really didn't dare to write in other places, or they were not simply allowed. First wave feminist activism, of course, was very heterogeneous and was characterized by constant controversy and debates. So theoretical contributions were also diverse in their analysis of equality and differences between women and men. Women's suffrage was influenced above all by Enlightenment ideals, such as Mary Wollstonecraft's, by anti-slavery struggles, and also had an influence of the romantic vision of women and the discourse of the women's excellence and moral superiority. In most cases, attributable to the different education received, as well as to the exercise of the role played by women as those who care of life. So they were aware of this. Philosophers, for example, such as Julie Favre, Clarisse Coignette, or Antoinette Brown Blackwell, they took up some of these ideas about these moral qualities linked to women, but always explaining that this was the result of the gender, social, and cultural construction, right? Harriet Martineau studied, for example, the relationship between religion, philosophy, and science in her book, How to Observe Morals and Manners. And she defended the intellectual incapacities between boys and girls were the same. Clarisse Coignette, as a Kent scholar, she argues that women were ends in themselves. So it's quite interesting. But I'm going to explain a little bit more about this continuum. I'm going to I have several examples, right? In a certain moment of the continuum, I would talk about philosopher, novelist, and poet Antoinette Brown Blackwell, which I mentioned. She was committed to women's suffrage, and she left a considerable body of work, many books, right? And she was highly critical of androcentric bias in philosophy and science, right? In her work, The Sexes Through Nature, that was 1875, she analyzes the works of Spencer and Darwin as evolutionists and criticizes these authors, which uphold the idea of a natural inferiority of women. Women couldn't, they couldn't use abstract thought. They could imitate males, right? So she says there is a dogma of male superiority, and this is above scientific rationality and coherence. So Blackwell, quote, I'm going to quote her. She says, Mr. Darwin asserts that males have evolved muscularly and cerebrally superior to females, and that this results in the former passing on their preeminent qualities mainly to their male descendants, because intelligence was inherited by sons from their fathers, right? Not even in your own school of evolutionists should these conclusions be accepted without questioning. Men, she says, are only able to perceive clearly and to think lucidly with regard to everything in which their interests are well taken up. End of the quote. So Blackwell shows how erroneous and biased these conceptions were. She criticizes these authors and other authors and maintains that in order to assess and compare the capacities of men and women, it would be necessary to ensure that they start from equal environmental conditions, which is something that seems to us quite obvious, but it seems that they're not, sometimes they're not so obvious, right? In this continuum, as I said, there are other authors I'd like to talk about that developed these ideas and critical reflections, ethical reflections, right, in a less systematic way. And we've had this from the beginning of the 19th century. If you think of in the US, the Sarah and Angelina Grimke, right, the abolitionist sisters, right, in 1937, they're already writing about how men have tried to override our mental capacities and to injure our sense of morality on the basis of their interpretations, right? They say, nowhere does God say that there are any moral or intellectual differences between men and women. In the same line, if you think of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the Seneca Falls feminists, right? They were strong advocates of co-education, and they criticized how boys and girls were educated differently. They say, is there a male and female way of solving a square root? They ask. All right. Also, Anthony says the same doctrine that assigns to women the sphere of the affections is the one that subjugates to the wisdom of men. Cady Stanton adds, men's desires become their rights. Of course, if you think of this, this has a lot to do with present debates and 20th century debates. Harriet Taylor Mill, British feminist, she says, well, women have shown themselves capable of the highest social functions in the exact proportion in which they have been admitted, right? Because she criticized the prejudice of women's natural inclination to be dependent, submissive, etc. She says, if preference were natural, there would be no need to compel it by law. No legislator has thought it necessary to make laws to compel people to follow their natural inclination, right? If you think of Christabel Pankhurst, right, one of the most famous activists, She talks about this nature, women's nature. She says, it is false that women have a weak nature, but rather they are forced to live in circumstances which weaken them, such as the high prevalence of venereal diseases, which directly attack women's sexual health and vitality, lack of exercise, or unhealthy and unhygienic dress. End of the quote. Right. And now I'd like to talk about finally a couple of authors which really are young at the beginning of the 20th century, right? We can see that in those times, before the Great War, women were this generation, third generation of women suffrage fighters, were much more open regarding what they could say in their speeches and books, pamphlets, and so on. Particularly interesting, and these are authors I'm presently working on because I think they are clear antecedents of second wave feminists and many of the concepts that we have inherited from the 60s and 70s. Helena Swanwick, right? She rejected the idea of different nature of the sexes, as well as the fact that women were defined according to male interests. We find in her text criticism of what today we call heterodesignation, right? I'm going to read a couple of her quotes. She says, men imagine the qualities they find desirable in women and shape an ideal of woman on the basis of those qualities. They then call those real flesh and blood women who do not conform to that an asexual ideal, not normal woman, right? Okay. And she also says, it has been the easy custom of most men to divide women crudely into good and bad. The good woman is superhuman and the bad woman is subhuman, right? So, as I said, she's writing this at the beginning of the 20th century. This idea about men divide and patriarchy dividing women into good and bad was very much rejected by 19th century feminists, such as the great Josephine Butler, for example. She always criticized this idea. She talked about women's sisterhood and so on. Helena Swanwick further insisted on the legitimizing role of inequality exercised by scientists. Scientists, doctors, medical doctors were very much rejected by first wave feminists, right? About these scientists, she says, I quote, reactionary scientists tell us about the normal woman. To define it, they take away from each woman any individual quality that makes her different from other people and stick to what they all have in common, that is sex and motherhood. From this, they conclude that women must be trained exclusively for these two purposes. There is no such thing as a normal woman. It is an invention of the male mind, and all women suffer because of this tyranny. Right? She also studied the role of the cultural production in reinforcing what is womanly and unwomanly, as well as the role of the commercialization of women's bodies. Okay, really interesting. So there's another author, which is more or less her generation. This is the South African writer, Olive Schreiner, okay, which was also a novelist, which I want to start with one of her, some words of her. She insisted on this idea. She said, personal life is a great battlefield, right? These words remind us, of course, of the slogan of radical feminists in the 60s, 70s, the personal is the political, right? She has an excellent book written in 1911 called Woman and Labor. this was a great book, which took her a long time. She did a lot of research to explain the history of the sexual division of labor, right? And she explains how material conditions, needs, and interests have conditioned the role of women in this division of labor, right? For her, the human being must be a compendium of rationality and intellect, emotion and tenderness, right? Therefore, both sexes are capable of developing all the aspects to be better and more complete persons, right? She writes, I quote Olive Schreiner, "We demand that in the new world which is to come for men and women, where nothing will be as it is and things will assume new forms and relationships," she was really optimistic, as you can see, "we also have our share in the honorable and socially useful human tasks, and as well our half in the work of caring for children, nothing more and nothing less," right? That's 1911. So Schreiner found no difference between the sexes from birth, but what the sexes were molded differently by society, right? So using scientific and sociological arguments, she concludes that it's entirely artificial and unnatural how girls are influenced to develop certain skills. So we are still, presently, we're still arguing about this. It's incredible. The only real difference in her view is that marked by the reproductive function linked to care. It appears to be this way. So thus, women's experiences of care lead to development of qualities of empathy and dialogue, which make their contributions to society different from those of men, and make women constitute themselves as a class. In other words, their social apprenticeship in specific material conditions make them more favorable to the defense of arbitration in conflicts. This idea was very much present in all those pacifist meetings just before and during the Great War, right? So all these, we find all these of this discussion, we find early antecedents to the late 20th century debates, for example, on the ethics of care and the ethics of justice, right? As those, if you remember the Kohlberg, Gilligan, and the Ben Habib debate, right, about care and justice. So it's very interesting to trace all these antecedents in our 19th century feminist sisters. Going back to this idea of the continuum, if we look at, there are very interesting essays which I think would fall into the category of moral and political philosophy. I just think of Charlotte Perkins and her feminist utopia, Herland, written in 1915, incredibly interesting. She talks about a new society free of androcentrism and gender class oppression, right? She defends the importance of women's autonomy and the right not to be designated, classified, named according to men's standards, to the male standards, right? And I just finish this saying that 19th century feminists were also very critical of oppression in the private sphere. It's not true that they didn't talk about these issues. It is normally thought that they just talk about the public sphere. I am going to finish quoting Cicely Hamilton, a great writer, playwright, actress, and essayist. She has an excellent essay that should be more well known, I think, Marriage as a Trade, written in 1909. I mean, this is a strong critique of women's role in marriage and the interests of male to keep it that way, right? An excellent text, which I recommend. I'll just quote her and finish my speech with this quote. She says, "As soon as one comes to examine the subject of the natural sphere of woman and woman's work with anything like an open mind, one discovers that in at least 9 cases out of 10, the word suitable or artificial must be substituted for the word natural, right? So there was a strong critique, and of course they didn't use our language, but they were perfectly aware of what the patriarchal system was and how oppression was exerted through gender stereotypes and so on, and how all this was something that could be changed, right? Discrimination and inequality between the sexes, that was something that could be changed, and they were all really optimistic and positive that that was something that was really about to change. Okay, well, thank you very much, and I'll leave it here.
Thank you very much for this great and very comprehensive talk.